What I've attempted to do is to discuss how good faith is being applied at the moment in investment law. Good faith pervades our understanding of international law, and its application in investment law is equally complex and equally diverse. What I was struck by in my own practical experience and in terms of what I was reading in the cases is the amount of times that good faith, the principle of good faith, was being relied on. And it was a question of if it was how it was being used and whether it was being misused. And so what I attempted to do is, I guess, get to the bottom of what this principle was, whether it was useful, whether it was a disadvantageous thing for the entire field of investment law. So what I've done in the book is I've broken it down into three main aspects of it. First, trying to establish, or rather discuss, whether there's a definition that comes behind it and how that applies in investment law, and then looking at it in the proceedings from the perspective of before the dispute has even arisen, during the disputes, and then in the final issues. And so maybe taking piece by piece, kind of slowly through what we've just discussed here, as it starts in this question of the definition. I've pulled from public international law sources and private international law sources, necessarily because of the dynamics of investment law, this borderline area between public international law and private international law, how the investor fits into this piece. So the book attempts to first set the basis for where the principle is coming from, the complication of how is the investor bound by the issue of by the principle of good faith. The relationship between the states, it's coming through more so in the treaty relationship, the Pacta Sunt Servanda, that's coming out of the VCLT Article 26. But then how does this then come into the proceedings from a public international law perspective through interpretive good faith, through Article 31.1? How are we reading and interpreting the treaty in the plain meaning in good faith? So in the first section of the book, I've attempted to look at this definition and then also take it into the domestic law definition, because the arbitrators involved are always informed by their own educational background, and also informs their use and application of it in the decisions themselves, and also informs the way that counsel are interacting with this principle as it's being applied during the treaties, during the hearings. So from this basic definition, questioning whether it's good even to have a definition of the principle of good faith, or questioning and looking at it from a broader perspective of perhaps it's dangerous to have it too closely defined. From there, I turn to issues of jurisdiction, mostly, how good faith informs the definitions of investment, of investor, nationality, how that's coming into play, whether abuse of the process is also applying the principle of good faith, where the borderline cases are, where it's not quite abuse of process, but it's still jurisdiction being denied on the level of good faith. How is this coming into the dynamics of the jurisdictional phase, whether it comes into the definition, whether it necessarily comes into the definition. Part of this is looking at it from the perspective of where the arbitrators are coming from, whether they're focused more on treaty law, investment treaty law, rather as public international law, part of the system of public international law, or looking at it more from a contractual standpoint, how this is interacting and impacting the way that it's being applied to these types of definitions. From there, I moved to more issues of proceedings, how the principle of good faith is being used in evidence, following from the soft law guidance out of the IBA rules, where then it goes and flows into the discretion of the tribunal. how do they legitimize their discretion? Oftentimes they'll legitimize it by saying this evidence was simply not presented in good faith, or will weigh it differently because it wasn't provided in good faith, or something that will come up later in the book then, how perhaps submitting evidence outside of good faith then affects costs. The other aspect in the proceedings themselves that the principle of good faith has come into is with respect to the behavior of parties, the behavior of the arbitrators, the counsel, witnesses, how this is informing and legitimizing the use and application of the treaties where there's gaps, for example, where there perhaps needs to be additions beyond the words that are written into the treaties. And the final substantive chapter deals with costs and how currently it's being, investment tribunals have all kinds of different ways of deciding on costs, but there seems to be a growing trend of the principle of good faith coming into their discretion on costs and whether or not they should be divided, equally, or whether they should be taken by the losing party. And then in the end of the book, of course, I just tried to provide an overview of how this principle is used, whether it's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, its legitimizing function, its gap-filling function, and ultimately its connecting function, allowing investment law to rest within this position of public international law. There's a number of big challenges right now in investment arbitration, so narrowing it down to one can be a bit complicated. But I think ultimately the legitimacy of the system right now, as we're seeing particularly European states no longer being supportive of the system, and the way that it's infecting the global perceptions of it as well, I think is very much creating a conflict within the system, and a discussion that necessarily has to happen. Legitimacy issues may be coming out of things such as the overuse of certain arbitrators, the dual hatting issues, and its implications to the system itself and to the growth of the system. But I think that it all fits into how the system is fitting into public international law, where it's fitting. So these issues of legitimacy come down to these problems and aren't necessarily something that should be immediately resolved, but really have to be thought about much more thoroughly before it can come to a proper conclusion on it. I'm excited for these reforms in general. I'm excited to see where they go. But I say this with hesitation, whether or not the system is looking broadly enough in terms of where it fits and how it fits. Some of the recent decisions in the European context, I think, are creating more instability than stability in its complete impacts. And I think some of those decisions, the long-term impacts of them, need to be better considered. I don't know if it's a change that I'm excited about, but it's something that is changing and is growing, and we'll see where it takes us. I found a number of the discussions very interesting. I think it was a nice mix of people that were involved and opinions that could be brought up that brought forward a diverse perspective on what's happening. I particularly enjoyed this session with respect to how these outside environmental climate change impacts could potentially, how are they interacting with investment law itself? What does this mean for the system? And how does this reconceptualize the way that we look at investment law? I thought it brought forward some interesting aspects of the interrelationship and the regime interaction that maybe needs to take place in the future.